She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who never showed up, and when the storm hit, the whole town watched her fall, and not one soul moved to help. Nathan Walker had sworn off people years ago. He'd buried his reasons deep in the Colorado mountains and never looked back. But the moment he saw her on her knees in the mud, trembling and abandoned, something cracked open inside him that 10 years of silence had sealed shut. He stepped forward, and nothing was ever the same again. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 did not arrive gently in the Colorado Territory. It came in heat that cracked the earth and dried the creek beds to pale ribbons of cracked mud. It came in skies that went from blue to purple in under an hour, dragging walls of black cloud down from the Rockies without a breath of warning. It came the way most hard things came to the frontier, fast, without apology, and without concern for whoever happened to be standing in its path. Nathan Cole Walker had lived in these mountains long enough to read the weather the way other men read a newspaper. He knew what those clouds meant when he saw them building over the ridge that Tuesday afternoon. He knew he had maybe 40 minutes before the sky opened up and made the lower road impassable. He'd seen men lose horses in that mud. He'd pulled a wagon out of a ditch once with nothing but a rope and a mule, and 3 hours of cursing that he wasn't proud of. He urged his horse, a big dark bay he called Hector, into a faster walk down the switchback trail. He had flour and salt and a new coil of rope in his saddlebag. Nothing urgent. Nothing that couldn't have waited. But Nathan Walker had learned a long time ago that the mountains rewarded the careful and punished the careless. And he was not a careless man. He heard her before he saw her, not crying. He would have said something about that later if anyone had asked that she wasn't crying. She was arguing. "I am not leaving until someone tells me where the telegraph office is." Her voice cut clean through the sound of the wind picking up along the lower road. "I have a right to send a wire. I have a right to know what happened." "Lady, I told you twice already." A man's voice, impatient and slick with contempt. "Harlan Briggs is not in Coldwater Creek. Never was. You got taken. Happens all the time to women like you. Now I suggest you figure out your situation before that storm hits, because we are closing up." "Women like me." She repeated it slowly, like she was deciding whether to be afraid of those words or angry at them. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Nathan came around the bend in the road and saw them. She was standing outside the door of the Coldwater Creek General Store, a battered leather traveling bag at her feet, and a smaller case clutched in both hands. Her dress had been fine, once pale blue cotton, with small white buttons, but the hem was thick with trail dust, and one of the sleeves had torn at the shoulder seam. She was not tall. She was not the kind of woman you'd call imposing. But she was standing absolutely straight, her chin level, her eyes fixed on the man in the doorway with an expression that had nothing defeated in it. The man in the doorway was Ed Pruitt, who ran the general store, and had, in Nathan's limited experience, never passed up an opportunity to make someone feel small. "I mean," Pruitt said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "women who answer mail-order advertisements from men they've never met and travel halfway across the country on a promise. I mean women who ought to have better sense. That's what I mean." Two women on the covered porch of the dry goods store across the street had stopped pretending to mind their own business. A boy of about 12 was watching from the corner with his mouth open. 3 men stood near the water trough, arms crossed, expressions that mixed boredom with the particular pleasure people sometimes took in other people's misery. Nobody moved. Nathan pulled Hector to a stop. The woman. She hadn't looked at him yet, lifted her chin another fraction. The advertisement was legitimate. The agency was legitimate. "I have the paperwork. And I would like to use the telegraph so that I can contact the agency and find out what happened to Mr. Briggs, because there must be an explanation." "The explanation," said one of the women from the porch, "is that he took one look at whoever was coming and decided he'd rather stay wherever he was. I've seen his kind before. You're not the first, honey." The small laugh that went around the group was not kind. Nathan dismounted. He did it slowly, the way he did most things, deliberately, without hurry, and he tied Hector to the post at the edge of the road with 2 half hitches and then walked across to where the woman was standing. He stopped a few feet away from her, put his back to Ed Pruitt's storefront, and looked at her directly. She looked back at him. Her eyes were brown, the kind of brown that was almost amber in the right light, and they held a wariness that he recognized, the particular watchfulness of someone who had learned not to trust quickly and was now furiously calculating whether the newest threat was coming from the front or the side. He took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Nathan Walker. I've got a ranch up on the north slope about 4 miles out. I'm heading back there now before that storm comes in." He glanced at the bag at her feet, then back at her face. "I've got room. A separate room," he added, because he was not a fool, and he knew what it looked like, and he knew what she was thinking. "With a lock on the door. If you want to wait out the storm somewhere dry and figure out your next step in the morning, you're welcome to it." Silence. Not from her, from everyone else. Pruitt made a sound in the back of his throat. "Walker. Ed." Nathan didn't turn around. "I don't recall asking for your opinion." The woman stared at him. He could see her working through it, the offer, the man making it, the alternatives. The storm was maybe 30 minutes out now. He could smell the metal in the air. "Why?" she said. He considered that for a moment. "Because no decent person leaves a woman alone on a road in weather like this. And because—" He paused, looking at the people who'd been watching with their arms crossed and their mouths shut. "Seems like you could use one decent person about now." She looked at the crowd, then at the sky, then at him. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "That's my name." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Whitmore." She picked up her traveling bag. "I accept." The ride up to the ranch was mostly silent. Clara Whitmore held herself carefully on the back of the saddle behind him, both hands gripping the leather strap he'd fashioned across Hector's flanks for exactly this kind of occasion. Not his occasion. He'd never done this before, but he'd had it there because he was a man who believed in being prepared. She didn't complain about the trail, which was rocky and steep and got worse in the last mile. She didn't ask questions. The wind had started coming down hard off the ridge, and talking would have been difficult anyway. He heard her breath catch once when the first real crack of lightning split the sky over the eastern peaks. "That's far enough away," he said, raising his voice over the wind. "We're almost there." She didn't answer, but her grip on the leather strap didn't loosen. He got them into the barn just as the rain started. Not gentle rain, the Colorado high country kind, hard and sudden and cold. Even in midsummer, the kind that turned a dirt road to soup in 10 minutes. He got Hector unsaddled and rubbed down and settled with his grain while the storm hammered the roof overhead, and he did all of it with Clara Whitmore, sitting on the 3-legged stool in the corner of the barn, her bag on her lap, watching him with those careful amber eyes. "You do that every night?" she asked when he finished. "Brush him down." "Yes." "Even in the dark?" "I've got a lantern." She was quiet for a moment. "He's a good horse." "He's the best horse," Nathan said, and he meant it the way he meant most things, completely without decoration. He showed her the house. It was not a fine house, he knew that. 2 rooms and a kitchen with a sleeping loft above the kitchen that he used himself. And the second room, the one with the lock that had belonged to his parents once, and that he had not slept in since the year he was 23. He'd kept it clean out of habit. The bed was made up with a quilt his mother had pieced together from wool blankets. There was a window that looked north toward the high peaks. "Wash basins in the kitchen," he said. "Outhouse is around back. I'll keep to my side of the house." Clara set her bag on the bed and turned around. In the lamplight she looked exhausted. Not the kind of tired that one night's sleep fixed, but the deep kind, the kind that came from holding yourself together so long that the effort had started to cost something essential. "I'm not your charity case," she said. The words came out flat, but there was something underneath them that was not flat at all. "No," Nathan agreed. "You're not. I will work for my stay. Whatever needs doing. I won't sit around." "All right." She studied him. "You don't argue much. I find it wastes time." He set the lantern on the small table by the door. "There's cornbread left over from supper and a can of beans in the kitchen if you're hungry. I'll be up at 5. You can sleep as long as you like." He turned to go. "Oh, Mr. Walker," he stopped. "Why did you do it?" she asked. not aggressive, genuinely asking. "Those people in town, they all knew you. You've got a reputation there, I could see that. Nobody argued with you, and you spent it on a stranger. I'd like to understand why." Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment. The rain was still coming down hard. He could hear it against the glass. "I've been left alone in something before," he said finally. "Wasn't a storm, didn't matter. The feeling's the same." He looked back at her. "Nobody came. I always figured if I ever got the chance to be the one who came, I'd take it." He went to the kitchen. She was quiet for a long time after that. She was up before he was. He came down the ladder from the loft at 4:15, already dressed, expecting to put the coffee on and start the morning alone, the way he'd started every morning for 10 years. Instead, he found Clara Whitmore standing at the stove in her dress from the day before she'd taken a cloth to the dust on the hem. He noticed with the coffee already boiling and 3 eggs cracked into the iron pan. She didn't look startled to see him. She just glanced up and said, "I found the eggs. The chickens were already awake. I hope that's all right." He sat down at the kitchen table. "It's all right." She put the eggs on a plate and slid it across to him, then poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him with hers and ate standing. No, she pulled out the other chair. Actually sat in it, which he noticed because in 10 years no one had sat in that chair. "I need to send a telegram today," she said. "When the road clears. Road'll be passable by mid-morning. I need to contact the Bridgeway Matrimonial Agency in Kansas City. They arranged the match with Mr. Briggs. Either the man is dead or injured or—" She stopped, drew a breath. "Or he's a fraud and the agency has a responsibility to answer for that." "What's in the smaller case?" he asked. She looked up. "My paperwork, the correspondence, the contract." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I have everything. His letters, the agency agreement, the record of my payment." Nathan ate a bite of egg. "You paid, women pay a placement fee for the service." Her voice was perfectly level. $22. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of money." "It is." She looked out the window. The sky was starting to lighten at the eastern edge, pale gray going to pink. "It was most of what I had left after the train fare." She paused. "I sold my mother's writing desk to pay for the ticket." He didn't say anything to that. She turned back from the window. "I'm not asking for sympathy, Mr. Walker. I'm telling you my situation because you asked about the case, and because I believe in being honest when someone has shown me a kindness. The fact is, I am 27 years old. I am 2,000 miles from where I started, and the plan I came here with has collapsed. I need to think." "Then think," he said. She blinked. "That's all." "What else would I say?" She stared at him for a moment, and then something happened in her face. Not crying. She wasn't going to cry. He'd already figured that out about her. But some of the rigid control around her mouth softened just slightly, like she'd expected an argument or advice or pity, and the absence of all of them was something she didn't quite know what to do with. "Most people have opinions," she said. "Most people," Nathan said, "haven't got enough of their own trouble to keep them busy." Cha-tang. He took her into Coldwater Creek at 9:30 when the road was solid enough for the wagon. He waited outside the telegraph office while she went in with her smaller case. He sat on the wagon bench and watched the street and let people watch him back and said nothing to anyone. She was inside for 40 minutes. When she came out, she walked to the wagon, climbed up without help, and sat beside him with her case on her lap and her eyes straight ahead. He picked up the reins. "Ready?" "Yes." He turned the wagon north. They were halfway up the first rise before she said anything. "The agency says Mr. Briggs withdrew his application 6 weeks ago. They claim they sent a letter." She paused. "I never received a letter." He didn't say anything. "They are offering a partial refund. $11. Her hands tightened on the case. $11 for my mother's writing desk, for my train ticket, for arriving in a town where I don't know a soul, and being told in front of half the population that I'm the kind of woman who ought to have known better." The wagon wheel hit a rut and lurched. He steadied the horses. "They are not very concerned," Clara continued in that same level voice. The man at the telegraph key kept looking at me like I should go away. Like this was embarrassing. Like I was the embarrassing part. She took a slow breath through her nose. I am not embarrassing. I trusted a process that failed. That's a different thing. Yes, Nathan said. It is. She turned and looked at him sideways. You're very easy to talk to for someone who doesn't say much. I listen, he said. People don't do that enough. She turned back to the road. After a moment she said, What do you do up here, Mr. Walker, on your ranch? What do you actually do all day? He considered that. Cattle. I've got 32 head right now. Work the fence line. Mend what breaks. Grow what I can in the kitchen garden. It's a short season up here. Chop wood. Haul water. Fix the things that wear out. He paused. There's a lot of things that wear out. Do you have help? Seasonal. Man named Two Feathers comes up for 3 weeks in the fall for the drive. Otherwise, no. You run 32 head of cattle alone. I work hard. She was quiet for a moment. I can work hard, she said, not offering, just stating a fact, the way she said most things. I know, he said. She looked at him. You don't know that. You've known me for less than a day. You were up before 4 o'clock after the worst day of your life, and you had a man's breakfast on the table before he came down. That tells me what I need to know. She said nothing for a while after that. When they got back to the ranch, she asked him where the kitchen garden was, and he showed her, and she spent the rest of the afternoon on her hands and knees pulling weeds from between the bean rows with the kind of focused, quiet intensity that he recognized because it was the same thing he did himself when he needed his head to go quiet. He left her to it. That evening she asked him about the land. They were on the porch. He'd built it facing west, which everyone who saw it for the first time called a strange choice until the sun went down and the sky over the mountains turned the color of something no one had a good word for. She'd brought her coffee out and sat in the other chair, the one that had been empty for 10 years, and he supposed that was the theme of this particular day. How long have you been here? She asked. 12 years. Alone. 10. She absorbed that. What happened? He looked at the sky. My father built this place, came out from Kentucky in 1859 with my mother and a wagon and a plan. Spent 12 years building it up. When I was 20, I came out to work it with him. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Fever took them both, same winter, 2 years apart. I'm sorry. Thank you. And you stayed. This is my family's land. He said it simply the way you said something that was not a choice you'd made, but simply a fact about yourself. I stay. Clara looked out of the mountains. They were going purple in the last light. I had a family too, she said. Different kind of loss. My father's business failed when I was 24. We lost the house. My mother passed the following year. I think the humiliation of it was harder on her than the poverty. And my father? She stopped. He does what he can, but he's not well. Is that why you answered the advertisement? She took a moment. Partly. I won't pretend it was all romance and hope. The plan was practical. A husband with land and a settled life in a place where no one knew what my family had been. A fresh start. She set her coffee up on her knee. I'm not ashamed of it. People make practical decisions when they're in practical circumstances. She paused. I didn't account for being practical alone. He nodded slowly. Mr. Walker. She turned to look at him. I need to ask you something, and I would prefer a direct answer. Go ahead. How long can I stay here while I figure out my next step? I won't overstay my welcome. I need a number. A week. 2. I can be useful in the meantime. I can cook. I can garden. I saw the fence line needs work on the eastern side. You saw that this afternoon? I walked the perimeter while the beans were drying. She held his gaze. How long, Mr. Walker? He looked at her for a moment. She was serious. She was practical. She was sitting in his dead mother's chair on his dead father's porch asking him for a number, like it was a business transaction because that was the only kind of arrangement she could afford to trust right now. He said, How long do you need? She frowned slightly. I just said, I heard you. I'm asking a different question. Not how long you plan to impose. How long you actually need to sort out your situation and figure out where you want to go next. She was quiet. Because if you need a month, he said, the answer is a month. If it takes longer, we'll talk about it then. You're not a burden, Miss Whitmore. You pulled weeds for 3 hours this afternoon, and you'll probably reorganize my kitchen tomorrow morning without asking, and frankly the place could use it. He turned back to the mountains. What I've got is space and work. What you've got is time and sense. Seems like an arrangement that doesn't need a deadline to make it fair. Another silence. You are, she said slowly, the strangest man I have ever met. I've been told. It is not an insult. I know. She looked out at the mountains again. The last light was the peaks going from purple to deep gray. All right, she said finally. No deadline. Good. But I will pull my weight. I expect nothing less. She nodded as if that settled something. And maybe it did. 3 days later, Ed Pruitt's wife showed up at the gate. Nathan was out mending fence on the east side when he heard the wagon come up the road. He came back to the yard to find Vera Pruitt sitting in her buggy with 2 other women from town. Ruth Alderman and a woman named Hartley, whose first name he'd never bothered to learn, and Clara standing on the porch with her arms crossed, and an expression on her face that was completely deliberately neutral. Nathan Walker, said Vera Pruitt. She was a thin woman with a sharp face and a voice that she used like a tool. We've come to speak with this woman. She's got a name, Nathan said, walking toward the fence. He didn't hurry. Miss Whitmore. Miss Whitmore. Vera said it with a particular inflection that managed to make the word itself into a comment. We wanted to make sure she understood the situation here. The situation, Clara said from the porch. This is a small community, Miss Whitmore. Mr. Walker has a certain standing in this valley. People are... Vera paused delicately, concerned. About appearances. Concerned about appearances, Clara repeated. Whose appearances? It isn't appropriate, said Ruth Alderman, who had a kinder face than Vera, but apparently similar opinions. A single woman alone with a single man. You must understand how it looks. I understand perfectly how it looks, Clara said. I'm curious whether any of you were concerned about how things looked when I was standing in the street in your town with a storm coming in. Whether it looked appropriate to stand there and laugh. Silence. Because I remember that, Clara continued. I remember it quite clearly. I also remember that not a single one of you offered a dry porch or a cup of water, or even a kind word. Mr. Walker, a man I'd never met, offered me shelter and respect. So you'll forgive me if I find it somewhat extraordinary that you've driven 4 miles up a mountain road to tell me that the same man's generosity is an appearance problem. Vera Pruitt's mouth had gone very thin. There's no need to be... I'm being honest, Clara said. I find it saves time. Nathan looked at Clara on the porch, then at the 3 women in the buggy. He said, Ladies, road's still soft in the low spots. I'd recommend heading back before it gets warm. He tilted his hat just enough to be civil. Safe ride home. Vera Pruitt snapped the reins and turned the buggy around with more speed than necessary. Clara watched them go. When the buggy disappeared around the bend, she let out a long, slow breath. Nathan came to stand at the foot of the porch steps. He looked up at her. You all right? I've been dismissed by better people than Vera Pruitt, she said. And then, despite herself, I can't believe I said all of that. You said what was true. I said what I thought. Same thing usually. She looked down at him. In my experience, usually gets people into trouble. Only with people who prefer comfortable lies, he said. Seems like you're done accommodating that particular preference. She was quiet for a moment. Then something crossed her face that he hadn't seen yet, not a smile exactly, but the shape of one like a window opened just a crack. Yes, she said. I think I am. He nodded. He went back to fix the fence. She went back inside. And somewhere in the transaction between those two things, the honesty spoken, the space respected, the work returned to without ceremony. Something shifted between them, quiet and solid as a fence post driven deep into mountain ground. Neither of them would have called it anything yet, but it was there. The fence on the east side had 43 broken posts. Nathan knew because he counted them the morning after Vera Pruitt's visit, walking the line with a hammer in one hand and a can of nails in the other, cataloging the damage. The way he cataloged most problems methodically, without complaint, with the understanding that the only way out of a thing was through it. Clara came out at 7 with his coffee and a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth. She didn't hand it to him. She set it on the top rail of the fence and walked back to the house. He picked it up. That was the second week. By the third week they had a system, and neither of them had discussed building one. It had simply assembled itself the way useful things did, out of necessity, out of observation, out of two people paying attention to each other without making a performance of it. She cooked. He split wood. She reorganized the kitchen. He'd been right about that, and found space for things that had been stacked on the floor for years, and asked him once very precisely whether the shelf above the stove was load-bearing or decorative. And when he said decorative, she pulled it down with her bare hands and used the wood to patch the gap under the kitchen door where the draft came in every night. He watched that happen and said nothing, which she had come to understand was his version of impressed. He taught her how to feed the cattle. Not gently, he didn't have a gentle way of teaching, just a direct one, showing the thing once, and then standing back and letting her try it and correcting quietly when she got it wrong. She got it wrong twice and right on the third attempt, and didn't ask for acknowledgement, which he appreciated. She kept her room locked at night. He had offered her the lock. She used it. He had never once made her feel like she shouldn't. That she thought might be the strangest and most valuable thing about Nathan Cole Walker. It was on a Thursday, 18 days after the storm, that she found the ledger. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for the spare key to the barn, which Nathan had told her was on the hook inside the kitchen cabinet, and the key was there, but so was a battered brown ledger that had been wedged behind the coffee tin for what looked like several years. It fell out when she moved the tin. She caught it. She would have put it straight back, except that it fell open to a page that showed 6 months of accounts, and even an accidental glance told her what she needed to know. She put the coffee on and sat down at the kitchen table with the ledger and read the whole thing before he came in from the morning work. When he pushed open the kitchen door at 8:30, she was still sitting there. She looked up at him. "Your fence isn't the only thing that needs work." He stopped, looked at the ledger. His jaw tightened just slightly. "That was in the cabinet. It fell out." She held his gaze. "Nathan, you're losing money. I know what my accounts say. Do you know that you've been undercharging the Morrison brothers for grazing rights for 3 years? Do you know that the feed merchant in town has been billing you for a premium grade and delivering a standard grade, and the difference is 11 cents a bag, and you've bought," she flipped the page, "240 bags in the last 2 years. That's $26. He was very still. "And this?" She turned another page. "I don't even know what this entry is. $14 in March of last year listed as miscellaneous." "What is miscellaneous $14? "Harness repair," he said after a pause. "Then it should say harness repair." She set the ledger down and folded her hands on top of it. "You're a good rancher, Nathan, but your books are a mess. You're working this hard and hemorrhaging money in places you're not even watching." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He did not look defensive. He looked like a man who had just heard a truth he'd been avoiding and had decided after a moment's private reckoning to stop avoiding it. How bad? Not unsalvageable, but bad enough that if you had one bad winter, a bad calving season, a fence failure, a sick herd, you'd be in serious trouble. She paused. "Have you had a bad winter recently?" The pause he took before answering was its own answer. 2 years ago, he said. "Lost 11 head to a cold snap in April. Thought the season was done and I was wrong." "What did you do?" "Survived." She looked at him for a long moment. "Show me everything," she said. "Every account, every arrangement, every standing agreement you've got with people in town. I want to understand the whole picture." "Why?" "Because I'm here, and I'm good at numbers, and you've let me stay, so I'm going to be useful." She pushed the ledger toward him. "That's not charity. That's fair exchange." He picked up the ledger, looked at the page she'd been reading, set it back down. "All right," he said. She poured the coffee. They worked through it for 3 hours that morning. The ledger spread between them, Clara asking precise questions, and Nathan answering them with the slightly uncomfortable honesty of a man who had kept his financial life private for a long time and was finding that the exposure was less terrible than he'd expected. She didn't shame him. She didn't lecture. She simply looked at numbers and asked what they meant and listened to his answers and occasionally said in a very quiet voice, "We can fix that." By noon, she had a list. By the following Monday, she had written 2 letters, one to the Morrison brothers regarding a revised grazing fee, and one to the feed merchant in town. That was, Nathan said. When he read it, the politest letter he'd ever seen, that was also clearly a threat. "It's not a threat," Clara said. "It says you'll take the matter to the Territorial Commerce Board." "That's not a threat. That's a fact." She sealed the envelope. "A threat implies I might not follow through." He looked at her over the letter. "Would you—" "I've already inquired about the process," she said. "The nearest board is in Denver. It's a 2-day ride and a 30-cent filing fee." She met his eyes. "So yes." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Clara." "Yes. Thank you." She looked mildly surprised, not by the words, but by the directness of them. People didn't often say things that simply to her. They wrapped appreciation and qualifications in distances, in the particular carefulness of people who didn't want to admit they needed something. "You're welcome," she said, and meant it just as simply. The feed merchant replied within a week. He offered a credit of $18 less than the full 26, but Clara had expected negotiation and had written the initial letter accordingly. She wrote back accepting the credit and adjusted the ongoing agreement and filed the new terms in the ledger with a neat column of her own handwriting beside his cramped irregular figures. Nathan watched her do it at the kitchen table one evening and said without looking up from the harness he was mending, "Where'd you learn accounts?" "My father's business, before it failed." She didn't look up either. "I kept his books from the time I was 17. I was better at it than he was." A pause. "That's not a kind thing to say about your own father, but it's true." "Truth usually is unkind," Nathan said. "That's why people avoid it." She looked up at that. He was still looking at the harness. She watched him work for a moment, the sure, practiced movements of his hands, the economy of motion that characterized everything he did. He never wasted effort, never moved without purpose. She had noticed it the first morning, and she noticed it more clearly now 3 weeks in, because she'd started to understand that it wasn't coldness. It was precision. There was a difference, and it had taken her time in close quarters with him to learn it. "Nathan," she said. Why did you never marry?" His hand stilled for just a moment on the harness. Then he went on working. "Not something I planned." "But you must have had someone over the years." "There was a woman in Durango a long time ago, before my parents died." He didn't stop working. "She wanted a man who lived in town, in a house with a parlor and a view of the street. Somewhere a person could be seen." He paused. "I had this." He meant the mountain she understood, the land, the life he'd built on his father's ground. It wasn't enough for her. That was fair. I didn't argue it. "You don't argue much," Clara said. She realized she'd said that to him before that first night. "She wasn't wrong," he said. "Some people need to be seen. I never minded being quiet." Clara was quiet herself for a moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that there are people who confuse being quiet with being invisible. And that's a mistake. You're very much not invisible, Nathan." He looked up at her then. Directly the way he did sometimes, with a steadiness that most people found unsettling, but that she had come to find oddly comfortable. "No," he said. "I suppose with you around I'm not." She didn't know exactly what to do with that. She went back to the ledger. He went back to the harness. But the kitchen felt different after that, in the way that rooms sometimes did when something honest had been said in them. It was 2 days later when everything changed. Not gradually, not with warning. The way most things changed on the frontier all at once, without courtesy. Nathan had ridden down to the lower pasture to check on a cow that had been limping since Tuesday. Clara was in the kitchen garden. She heard the wagon before she saw it. Not the light rumble of a neighbor's buggy, but the heavy, self-important sound of a well-sprung carriage on the mountain road, the kind of vehicle that cost more than most men in the territory made in a year. She straightened up, pulled off her garden gloves, walked to the fence. The carriage was black, trimmed in brass. The man who climbed down from it was 50-something heavyset, with a coat that cost more than the carriage almost, and the particular posture of a man who had not been told no in a very long time. He had two men behind him, younger, quieter, standing in a way that had nothing casual about it. He looked at Clara with the politely dismissive expression of a man who saw a woman in a garden and immediately catalogued her as scenery. "I'm looking for Nathan Walker," he said. "He's not here," Clara said. "I expect him back within the hour. Can I help you?" The man looked at her more carefully. Something shifted in his face, not unpleasant exactly, but calculating. "You must be the woman from town, the mail-order one." Clara kept her face very still. "My name is Clara Whitmore, Miss Whitmore." He tried the name the same way Vera Pruitt had, which told her something immediately. "I'm Douglas Harker. I own the valley land south of here, the Morrison grazing tracts, the creek bottomland, and I've recently acquired the Alderman property." He paused to let that register. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Walker about his North Slope holdings." "Mr. Walker's North Slope holdings aren't for sale," Clara said. Harker smiled. "How would you know that?" "Because I know Mr. Walker." "You've known Mr. Walker for what?" He looked at her with a kind of easy contempt. "A month." "Miss Whitmore, I've been working this valley for 15 years. I know Nathan Walker's situation considerably better than a woman who arrived in a storm and hasn't got a train ticket home." He said it pleasantly. That was the worst part. Clara did not move. She kept her hands at her sides and her chin level, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that this man was accustomed to making women feel small so that they would step out of his way. She had stepped out of enough things. "Mr. Harker," she said, "I suggest you wait for Mr. Walker. He'll be back within the hour, as I said. You're welcome to water your horses at the trough." She looked at him steadily. "I'll let him know you're here." Harker studied her for a moment. Then he smiled again, the same smile, and went to wait by his carriage. Clara went inside. She didn't panic. She moved to the window where she could see the lower field road, and she waited, and when she saw Nathan on Hector coming up from the south pasture, she went outside and walked to meet him at the gate, and before he was fully off the horse, she said quietly, "Douglas Harker is here. He wants your land. He's the kind of man who's already decided he's going to get it." Nathan looked past her at the carriage. His face went still in a way she hadn't seen before, not angry, not afraid, but the particular stillness of a man who recognizes something that has been coming for a long time. "How long's he been waiting?" 20 minutes. "What did he say to you?" She told him precisely and completely, including the tone. Nathan's jaw tightened. "Come with me," he said. She blinked. "What? Come with me." He handed Hector's reins to her, trusted her with the horse she registered without a second thought, and walked toward Douglas Harker with the long, unhurried stride of a man who was on his own land and knew it. She tied Hector to the fence post and followed. Harker extended his hand when Nathan reached him. Nathan shook it once brief and direct. "Mr. Harker, you've met Miss Whitmore." Briefly. Harker's eyes moved to Clara with something new in them. A reassessment may be prompted by the fact that Nathan had said her name without any distancing qualifier. "I've come to discuss a business matter, Walker. I'd prefer to speak privately." "Anything you say to me you can say in front of Miss Whitmore," Nathan said. Just like that. No explanation, no apology for it. Harker looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "I'm prepared to offer you $4,200 for the North Slope property. The grazing land, the water rights, the cabin, and outbuildings." He held the paper out. "It's a fair price. I'd say it's a generous price." Nathan didn't take the paper. Harker's arm stayed extended. "Walker, this land is hard to work and you know it. The slope is too steep for significant crop farming. The cattle operation is small. The access road is barely passable in winter. I've got the resources to develop this land in ways you never could alone. He paused. I'm not trying to cheat you. I'm offering you the chance to take your money and start somewhere easier. Nathan looked at the paper, then at Harker. My father built this place in 1859, he said. My mother died here. I've worked this land for 12 years. There isn't a fence post on this property that wasn't set by a walker. He paused just for a moment. My answer is no. Harker lowered the paper. His expression shifted. Not angry yet, that would come later, Clara thought. Right now, he was recalibrating. I'd encourage you to think it over, he said. Take a few days. Talk it over with a brief glance at Clara, whoever you need to consult. I don't need days, Nathan said. I gave you my answer. Harker folded the paper carefully, returned it to his coat, and smiled the smile of a man who had been told no many times and knew that no was often just the beginning of a negotiation. I'll be in the area for some time, he said. The offer stands if you change your mind. He nodded to Clara not warmly and got back into his carriage. They watched it go back down the road. Clara waited until it was out of sight. Then she said, He's not done. No. Nathan agreed. He's not. He mentioned the Morrison grazing tracts. Those are to your south. She turned to look at him. If he owns the Morrison land and the Alderman land and he gets the creek bottom land, how much of your water access runs through his property? Nathan was quiet for a moment. Most of it. She let that sit. He doesn't need to buy you out if he can cut off your water. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen there before. Not fear, but the close cousin of it. The look of a man who had just had a danger named that he'd been feeling but hadn't shaped into words yet. How do you know that? He said. My father's business failed because a competitor bought the warehouse leases on either side of him and raised the access fees until he couldn't operate. She held his gaze. Different industry, same principle. You surround a person and then you make staying impossible without ever technically forcing them out. She paused. Mr. Harker knows this land, Nathan. He's been working this valley for 15 years. He knows exactly where your water comes from. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he said, I need to see the land records. Yes, she said. You do. The territorial office is in Glenwood Springs, 2-day ride. Then we should go, she said. He looked at her. We. She met his eyes. You need someone who can read a legal document without spending 3 hours on it. I've done more conveyancing paperwork than most men in this territory have seen. My father's lawyers tried to save his business for 2 years. I sat in on every meeting because he needed someone to remember what was said. She didn't flinch from what she was saying. I'm not suggesting you need me, Nathan. I'm saying that if you go alone, it'll take twice as long, and from what I saw in that ledger time is something you can't afford to waste right now. I was quiet. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he was going to say no, going to say he'd managed alone for 10 years, and he'd manage this alone too. She was already preparing herself for that answer, deciding she could respect it even if she thought it was wrong. He said, We leave at first light. She let out a breath. I'll pack the food. He turned back toward the barn. Then he stopped without turning around. Clara. Yes, what Harker said to you, about the train ticket. He still wasn't looking at her. You don't owe anyone an accounting of why you're here. She felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a good word for. No, she said quietly. I don't. He went to the barn. She went to the kitchen. That night, she sat at the table after supper and didn't take out the ledger. She sat with her hands around a cooling cup of coffee and thought about Douglas Harker's smile and her father's collapsed business, and the 2 years she'd spent in lawyers' offices learning the specific vocabulary of men who took things from other men using paper instead of force. She thought about Nathan standing in front of Harker's carriage with no paperwork and no lawyer and nothing but the plain, undecorated truth of his own life on that land and saying no. She thought that was either the bravest or the most dangerous thing she'd seen in a long time. Probably both. Probably both. She was awake before 4. She had the coffee on and the food packed and her travel case by the door before Nathan came down the ladder from the loft. He looked at the packed case, at the coffee, at her. "You slept," he said. "Enough," she said. He poured his coffee. "You worried." She considered being evasive and decided against it. "Yes, you... yes." He drank. "Good. Means we won't be careless." She handed him the wrapped cornbread and picked up her case. They went out into the dark morning and started down the mountain road and whatever waited for them in Glenwood Springs. The records. The truth about the water rights. The shape of Douglas Harker's reach across this valley. Clara Whitmore faced it the way she'd faced everything since the storm. Straight ahead, chin level, without flinching. And this time, she wasn't facing it alone. The road to Glenwood Springs took 2 days and told Nathan Walker more about Clara Whitmore than 3 weeks on the ranch had. She didn't complain. That he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was the quality of her silence, not the uncomfortable silence of someone performing patience, but the real kind. The kind that came from a person who had learned to live inside their own head and found it decent company. She watched the trail. She watched the sky. She asked one question every few hours, always precise, always worth answering. The first afternoon she asked him how he'd learned the land record system. He told her he'd had to learn it fast at 23 when his father died and the deed needed transferring. And he'd made 3 trips to Glenwood Springs in the space of 6 weeks and read everything they'd let him touch. The second morning she asked him what he knew about water rights law in the territory. He told her what he knew, which was not enough, and she listened and then told him what she knew from her father's property disputes in Pennsylvania. And they spent the next hour in the wagon trading pieces of a puzzle neither of them had all the edges of. By the time they reached Glenwood Springs at noon, on the second day they had a working theory of what Harker was doing, and it was worse than either of them had said out loud yet. The Territorial Land Office was a low building on the main street, with a clerk behind a wooden counter who looked at Nathan, and then at Clara, and then at Nathan again, with the elaborate non-expression of a man who had learned not to have opinions about who came through his door and what they were to each other. Nathan stated his business. The clerk pulled the records. Clara sat beside Nathan at the reading table and went through them faster than he could have alone. He watched her move through documents, her finger tracing columns, her lips moving slightly, her expression doing the thing he'd learned to read, where a small vertical line appeared between her brows when she found something she didn't like. She found several things she didn't like. "Nathan." Her voice was very quiet. "Look at this." He leaned over. She pointed to a deed transfer dated 4 months earlier. The Morrison grazing tracts, transferred to a holding company called Harker Land and Cattle Development. Then she pointed to another. The Alderman property. 2 months ago. Same company. Then she turned the page. The Creek Bottomland deed was there still in the name of a man called Silas Yunt. "He doesn't have this one yet," Clara said. "He said he'd acquired it. He said he'd recently acquired it. He hasn't filed the deed." She turned another page. "Look at the water rights registration. The creek that feeds your north pasture, where does it originate?" He traced it on the survey map. "Morrison land, which is now Harker's." She looked up at him. "He owns the headwater. If he files a senior water rights claim, and with the Alderman land creating a contiguous property boundary, he can argue prior use and divert the flow. Legally." She sat back. Her voice stayed flat controlled, but her hands on the table had gone very still. "He doesn't need to buy you out, Nathan. He just needs to wait until your herd can't drink." The room felt smaller. "How long do we have?" he said. "Until he files the claim. Could be a week. Could be tomorrow." She turned to the clerk at the counter. "Excuse me, is there a process for contesting a water rights claim before it's filed?" The clerk looked up. "Ma'am, you can only contest after filing. There's a 30-day challenge window. And if a claim is filed and unchallenged for 30 days, it stands as prior right." Clara turned back to Nathan. The vertical line between her brows had deepened. "We have a 30-day window once he files. If we can establish that your family has been using that water since 1859, continuous documented use, we can file a counterclaim for prior appropriation." Do I have documentation going back that far? She looked at him with an expression that said she already knew the answer. My father's papers, he said. At the ranch. I don't know what's there. I've never gone through all of it. Then that is the first thing we do when we get back. She gathered the papers she'd been working from and stood up. We need copies of these records. Nathan asked for the copies. The clerk produced them. Clara organized them into the satchel she'd brought, and Nathan paid the copying fee, and they were back in the wagon before 2 o'clock. She didn't speak for the first mile out of town. He let her think. He'd learned that the silence after she'd read something difficult was working. Silence, not worried silence, and interrupting it cost something. Finally, she said, there's something else. Tell me. The Silas Yunt deed, the creek bottomland. She turned the satchel strap over in her hands. Yunt's name is on the record, but there's a lien notation against the property. Someone lent him money against it. She paused. The lien holder is the First Territorial Bank of Coldwater Creek. He felt something cold move through him. Harker's got a relationship with that bank. How do you know? Ed Pruitt's brother-in-law is the bank manager. Harker's been doing business through that bank for 3 years. Everyone in the valley knows it. Clara was quiet for a moment, then with a precision that was almost admirable. So Harker doesn't need to buy the Yunt land at all. He just needs Yunt to default on the loan. Then the bank takes the land and Harker acquires it through the bank. She paused. That's a very clean arrangement. Is Yunt likely to default? I don't know Yunt's finances, but I'd wager Harker does. She turned to look at him. Nate, this has been planned for a long time. He didn't arrive at your ranch with an offer because he woke up one morning and thought of it. This is a campaign. He's been quietly assembling a land position around you for at least 4 months. The full shape of it settled over him, then cold and clear as snowmelt. He wants the mountain land specifically, Nathan said. Not just the valley. Your north slope controls the highest water source. If he owns everything from the creek headwater to the mountain runoff, he controls the water for the whole south end of the valley. Ranchers, farmers, everyone. She met his eyes. It's not about your ranch, Nathan. It's about what your ranch sits on top of. He drove in silence for a mile. Then he said, my father knew that. When he picked this land, he said to me once, water is the only thing that doesn't lie in a dry country. Whoever holds the high water holds the valley. Clara said very quietly, your father was a smart man. He was. He looked at the road ahead. And I have not been paying enough attention. She put her hand on his arm. Just briefly, a quick deliberate press like punctuation. You're paying attention now, she said. He looked at her hand, then at her face. She'd already taken her hand back, was looking at the road, her expression practical and forward-facing. He turned back to the road. They made camp that night by the same creek they'd stopped at on the way down. Clara built the fire because he was picketing the horses, and she'd watched him build it twice and learned how. She had coffee boiling by the time he was done. He sat across the fire from her and ate and thought about his father's papers in the cedar chest, under the bed, in the locked room, and whether there was anything in them that could save what his family had spent their lives building. Tell me about your mother, Clara said out of the dark on the other side of the fire. He looked up. You never talk about her, she said, not pressing, just leaving the door open. I was quiet for a moment. She played piano, he said. Hauled it all the way from Kentucky in the wagon. Don't ask me how I wasn't born yet. My father always said it nearly killed 2 of the horses. A pause. The piano's still in the house. I can't play. I never moved it. Clara absorbed that. That's why you keep the room. Partly. What's the other part? He poured more coffee, handed hers across. She used to say after my father died when she knew she was sick, she used to say that a house that remembers its people is a house worth keeping. He wrapped his hands around his cup. I never quite knew what she meant when she was alive. I understand it now. Clara looked at the fire. My mother's writing desk, she said. The one I sold for the train fare. She was quiet for a moment. I told myself it was just furniture. I was very sensible about it. She paused. I wasn't sensible about it. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She looked up. "We're going to find something in those papers," she said. It was not a hope, it was a decision. He believed her. That surprised him how completely and immediately he believed her. "Yes," he said, "we are." They reached the ranch by mid-afternoon the following day. Clara went straight to the locked room to the cedar chest, and Nathan brought it out to the kitchen table and opened it, and they went through 12 years of his father's papers together piece by piece. It took 4 hours. Clara organized everything. Letters, receipts, survey documents, timber agreements, a water use log his father had kept in a small brown notebook that Nathan had never opened. She read the notebook twice. The second time she read it, she pressed both hands flat on the table and sat very still for a moment. "Nathan," she said. He looked up. "Your father logged every use of the creek water from the spring of 1861 to the autumn of 1878. Every irrigation draw, every cattle water, every date." She turned the notebook toward him. 17 years of continuous documented water use, starting before anyone else in this valley had a recorded claim. He stared at the notebook. "Prior appropriation," she said. "First in time, first in right. Your family was using that water before the Morrison land was ever homesteaded, before anyone Harker's bought had any claim at all." She looked up, and in her eyes was something fierce and clean. "He can't take your water, Nathan. The law won't let him, not if we file first." He picked up the notebook, looked at his father's handwriting, the careful, deliberate hand of a man who believed in keeping records because he believed the truth was worth writing down. His throat did something he didn't have a word for. "We need to file immediately," Clara said. She was already pulling out the copies from Glenwood Springs, laying them against the notebook. "The earliest possible prior appropriation date supersedes all later claims. If we file tomorrow—" "The office opens at 8, he said. "Then we leave at first light." She was already writing. "I'll draft the claim tonight." He sat down across from her. "What do you need from me?" "The original deed. And your testimony of continuous residence. They may want a sworn statement." She looked up. "And I need you to trust me with the filing. I know the language. I can write this so it's unambiguous." "I trust you," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than most of her expressions, which were already harder to read than most people's. Then she nodded and went back to writing. He made supper. She ate without looking up from the draft. He cleared the table around her papers and washed the dishes, and when he came back, she handed him the draft without ceremony, and he read it from the top. It was the clearest, most precise legal writing he'd ever read. Every word earned its place. Every claim tied to a specific date and source. Nothing vague, nothing reaching, nothing that could be argued around. "This is good," he said. "It's correct," she said, like there was a difference. He handed it back. "It's both." She looked at him, then at the papers. "I'll write the final copy tonight." I went up to the loft. He lay in the dark and listened to the scratch of her pen from the kitchen below and the wind off the high peaks. And he thought about his father's notebook and his mother's piano in the locked room and the woman at his kitchen table who had come here on a collapsed plan and a broken promise and had spent the last hour writing the legal argument that might save everything his family had built. He did not sleep for a long time. They were in the land office in Glenwood Springs by 8:15 the next morning. The same clerk was behind the counter. He took the filing. He read it. He looked at the water use log. He looked at the filing dates on the Harker land and cattle records. He looked at Clara. "This prior appropriation date," he said. "Spring of 1861. This is documented. Original log in the handwriting of John Marcus Walker filed as Exhibit A." Clara's voice was even and clear. "Cross-referenced with the Homestead Deed of Record Exhibit B and the Territorial Survey of 1862, Exhibit C." The clerk looked at Nathan. "You're John Marcus Walker's son." "I am." The clerk stamped the filing. The stamp coming down on that paper was the loudest sound Nathan Walker had heard in a long time. "Filed," the clerk said. "Prior appropriation claim, Walker North Slope Ranch, dated from spring 1861. Any subsequent claim to that water source is junior to this right." Clara exhaled. Nathan did not. He stood very still and let the relief move through him slowly, the way cold water moved through a very dry man carefully, because too fast and it would knock you down. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the stamped document in the clerk's hand, with an expression that was not triumph exactly. It was too quiet for triumph, but was something solid and earned and real. "We should get certified copies," she said. "3," he agreed. While the clerk made copies, Nathan stood beside her at the counter and said in a voice low enough that only she could hear, "My father would have thanked you." She looked at him. "It was his notebook that did it," she said. "He kept the record. We just used it." Clara. "Yes. That's not the same as nothing." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the clerk. "I'll take those copies in order, please," she said, "with the file date on each one." They were back in the wagon by 9 o'clock. They had not been back on the road for 20 minutes when they saw the rider coming toward them from the north. Fast. Too fast for a social call. Nathan pulled the horses up. The rider resolved into a boy he recognized, Pete Alderman, 16 years old, who'd been working odd jobs at the livery since his family sold their land. Pete pulled his horse up beside the wagon, breathing hard. "Mr. Walker, I've been riding since sunup looking for you." "What happened?" "Harker's men were at your place yesterday evening, 2 of them. They said they were checking your fence line, but—" Pete swallowed. "But Joe Tandy saw them at the creek, at the diversion point on the upper channel. He said they were doing something to it. He didn't know what." Clara's hand closed around the satchel strap. Nathan's face went very still. "Did anyone stop them?" Joe tried to ask what they were about. They told him it was Harker's property and to mind his business. Pete looked miserable. He didn't know if he had a right. "He had every right," Nathan said. "Thank you, Pete." He reached into his coat pocket and pressed a coin into the boy's hand. "Go home. Don't tell anyone else you found me." Pete nodded and wheeled his horse back toward town. Nathan snapped the reins. Clara said, "If they've diverted the channel, then my north pasture will start drying out within a week." His voice was flat. "Before any filing does any good if I can't prove active use." "You have the water use log. You have the filing." "Nathan, a filing doesn't put water back in a creek." He pushed the horses harder. "And Harker knew we were in Glenwood Springs. Someone told him." The word sat between them. Someone. "The clerk," she said. "Or someone who saw us leave." He didn't look at her. His hands on the reins were tight. "Harker's been working this valley for 15 years. He's got eyes." They made the ranch in record time. Nathan was off the wagon before it fully stopped. He walked the creek trail at a pace she had to half-run to match, and she matched it anyway. And when they reached the upper diversion point, he crouched down and looked at the channel, and she crouched beside him and looked too. Someone had shifted the rock deflector. Not obviously, not a dramatic blockage, nothing that screamed sabotage to an uninformed eye. But the angle of it had been changed subtly, redirecting maybe a third of the flow into a shallow side channel that drained south. South. Toward Harker's land. "How long to affect the pasture?" she asked. "In this heat. A week, maybe 10 days before the cattle notice." He didn't touch the deflector. "If I move it back and he sends men again, document it first." She pulled out the small notebook she'd started keeping in her coat pocket. She'd bought it in Glenwood Springs without saying why, and she wrote the date and the time and a precise description of what they were looking at. "Then move it. Then we file a report with the Territorial Marshal's office." He looked at her. "This is property interference," she said, "on land where we now have a filed water rights claim. That's not a civil matter anymore, Nathan. That's criminal." He stood up. "The marshal in Coldwater Creek is Ed Pruitt's cousin." She didn't blink. "Then we write directly to the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver. I know the form. I'll write it tonight." She looked at him over the notebook. "This is what Harker wants. He wants you to react. To push back in a way that costs you legally or financially, or makes you look like the problem. Don't." Her voice was steady. "We move the deflector back, we document everything, we file the report. We let the law be slower than he wants and faster than he expects. He looked at the creek. At her. At the document in the satchel she still had over her shoulder. "You've done this before," he said. Not a question. "I watched my father lose because he got angry instead of organized," she said. "I promised myself I would never make that mistake." He moved the deflector back. She wrote down the time. They walked back to the ranch in the long evening light, and when they reached the gate, he stopped, and she stopped beside him, and they both stood there for a moment, looking at the house and the barn and the garden and the mountains above it all. And Nathan said without turning toward her, "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "When this is settled, whichever way it goes, what do you want to do?" She was quiet. "I'm not asking about Harker," he said. "I'm asking about you. What you want." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the house. His profile was the same as it always was, strong, contained, giving nothing away, unless you'd learn to read the small things. She'd been learning. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I came out here with a plan, and the plan was wrong. I've been building a new one a day at a time." She paused. "I know what I don't want. I don't want to go back to being the woman who survived on what she could manage alone. I've been managing alone for a long time, and I'm very tired of it." She looked away. "That's more honest than you probably needed." "No," he said quietly. "It's exactly what I needed." She looked back at him. He had turned his head. He was looking at her now, directly, with that steadiness that had alarmed her the first week, and no longer alarmed her at all. "I've been building this place alone for 10 years, he said. "I told myself that was strength. I'm not sure it was." He held her gaze. "I think it might have just been fear wearing a different hat." She felt something move in her chest. Nathan. And then the sound of hooves on the road below the gate stopped everything. Not one horse. Several. Moving fast, coming up from town. Nathan turned. Clara turned beside him. 4 riders came through the gate without stopping to ask permission. Douglas Harker was not among them, but his lawyer was a man named Colum Draper that Clara had seen in town once, who had a way of holding papers that communicated their contents before he'd said a word. Draper pulled his horse up 6 feet from where they stood. He looked at Nathan, then at Clara, then back at Nathan. "Mr. Walker, I have a notice here from the First Territorial Bank of Coldwater Creek." He held out the paper. "It relates to the note your father took out in 1871 against the North Slope property. The bank is calling the note." Nathan didn't move. Clara said, "What note?" Draper looked at her with the expression of a man who had decided she was not worth addressing. He kept his eyes on Nathan. "The 1871 loan note. $700 drawn against the North Slope deed. It has been held in dormancy at the bank under a standing arrangement. The bank is now exercising its right to call the balance due. You have 30 days. Nathan said, "My father paid that note." Draper reached into the papers he was holding and produced a second document. The bank's records indicate a balance outstanding of $430. Clara stepped forward. "I'd like to see that record." Draper looked at her, then finally with the deliberate condescension of someone deciding whether to bother. "And you are?" "Clara Whitmore. I'm Mr. Walker's." She paused for the space of a heartbeat, his financial representative. She held out her hand for the document. A silence. Draper extended the paper. She read it. Her face showed nothing. She read it a second time. Then she lowered it and said very calmly, "This record shows the 1871 loan. It does not show the payment made against it in March of 1873. She looked at Draper. "Mr. Walker's father made a substantial payment in 1873. I have the receipt in the ranch papers." She didn't know that. She was betting on it. Betting on the careful, documented nature of a man who had kept a 17-year water use log in a small brown notebook and never threw anything away. Draper stared at her. "The bank has no record of—" "The bank may have no record. Mr. Walker's family does." She handed the document back. "I'd suggest the bank review its own ledger before pressing a call notice, Mr. Draper. Because if this note has been altered, or if a payment has been conveniently omitted from the record, that is a different kind of conversation than the one you came here to have." The word altered landed in the air like a stone in still water. Draper's composure held, but just barely. The notice stands until the bank's records are verified." "Then verify them," she said. "We'll be going through our own records tonight. If there's a receipt, and I believe there is, I'll have a copy to you by morning." Draper looked at Nathan. Nathan had not moved or spoken since the paper came out. He was watching Clara with an expression she would have recognized if she'd been looking at him. She wasn't. She was watching Draper. 30 days, Draper said. He turned his horse. His men turned theirs. They were gone in 2 minutes. Silence. Clara stood very still, her hands at her sides, her heart beating considerably faster than her voice had suggested. Nathan said, "Are you sure about the receipt?" "No," she said. "But I am sure about your father." She turned. "He logged every gallon of water he took from that creek. He kept letters going back 20 years. I don't believe he paid $400 against a debt and didn't write it down." Nathan was already moving toward the house. The cedar chest again. Everything back on the kitchen table. They went through it faster this time because they knew what they were looking for. Nathan worked from the bottom of the chest and Clara from the top. She found it in 18 minutes. A receipt dated March 14, 1873. First Territorial Bank of Coldwater Creek. $430 payment in full. Signed by the bank manager, whose name was not the current manager, which meant someone had gone very deep into old records to construct a loan balance that had already been satisfied. Clara set the receipt on the table. Nathan looked at it. Then he looked at her. "He planned this too," Nathan said. His voice was very quiet. "The loan call. He had someone dig up the old note and strip the payment from the record. This has been in the works for months." "Yes," Clara said. "He thought I wouldn't have the receipt." "He didn't know your father," she said. Nathan looked at the receipt for a long moment. Then he said, "He didn't know you either." She looked up. I was looking at her with something she didn't have a category for. Yet, not gratitude, not admiration exactly, but something deeper than both and quieter. "Tomorrow," she said carefully, "we take this receipt and the certified water rights filing, and we put them in front of a judge." She held his gaze. "Not the bank, not Harker's lawyer, a judge." "The circuit judge is due in Coldwater Creek in 8 days, he said. "Then we have 8 days to build a case that Douglas Harker cannot talk his way around." She put the receipt carefully in the satchel beside the water rights filing and the creek diversion notes and the land records copies. She closed this clasp. She straightened up. And Nathan Walker stood across the kitchen from her in the house his father built with the evidence of a deliberate and sustained attempt to rob him of everything laid out on the table between them, and something moved across his face that was not defeat and was not resignation. It was the look of a man who had decided. "We'll be ready," he said. It wasn't a hope. It was the same kind of word she used, the kind that meant she'd already made it true inside herself before she said it out loud. She recognized it completely. "Yes," she said. "We will." 8 days was not a long time to build a case that could stand in front of a circuit judge. Clara knew that. Nathan knew that. They didn't discuss it. They simply started working and didn't stop. The first morning after Draper's visit, Clara wrote 4 letters. One to the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver, documenting the creek diversion. One to the Bridgeway Matrimonial Agency in Kansas City, not about her own situation, but requesting their record-keeping procedures as precedent for how financial transactions were documented in the territory. One to a land attorney in Denver whose name she'd found in the Glenwood Springs office records. And one, the most careful of all, to the circuit court, requesting that the matter of Walker versus First Territorial Bank of Coldwater Creek be placed on the docket for Judge Harold Crane's upcoming session. Nathan watched her write the last one. "You know Crane's name." "I asked the land office clerk while you were getting the horses." She didn't look up. "He said Crane is thorough, doesn't like waste." She sealed the envelope. "That's good for us. Our case is clean. And Harker's isn't. Harker's case depends on records that contradict a paid receipt. That's not a case, that's a gamble." She set the envelope on top of the others. "He's betting we don't have the documentation. We do." Nathan picked up the letters. "I'll ride them to the post." Take the copies of the water rights filing too. The Denver attorney needs to see everything. He took the papers. At the door he stopped. Clara. Yes. Have you eaten anything this morning? She looked at the cold coffee beside her elbow. I had coffee. That's not eating. Nathan, I'll put something on the stove before I go. He didn't make it a discussion. He went to the kitchen, put leftover cornbread and a piece of dried beef on a plate, set it in front of her papers, and left. She ate without taking her eyes off the draft she was reviewing. That was the first morning. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that was urgent without being frantic. Nathan working the ranch in the mornings, watching the creek level, tending the herd with one eye always toward the southern fence line. Clara at the kitchen table with the papers, building the legal argument layer by layer, the way her father's lawyers had built theirs, except better because she'd learned from watching them lose. On the third day, Joe Tandy came up from town. He was a rancher from the South Valley, gray-haired, deliberate, the kind of man who chose his words the way a careful carpenter chose his boards. He tied his horse at the gate and took his hat off when Clara opened the door, which she noted because most men in Coldwater Creek had stopped extending her that courtesy. Miss Whitmore, he said, I need to talk to Walker. He's on the east fence. I can get him, or I can hear what you have to say. Tandy looked at her, made a decision. Both, if you don't mind. She got Nathan. They sat on the porch, all three. Tandy turned his hat in his hands and said, Harker's been around, talking to people. He's telling folks that Walker's been running an illegal water diversion for years, taking more than his share from the creek. He paused. He's got 2 men from the Morrison property who'll say they've seen it. Nathan's jaw tightened. That's false. I know it is. I've ranched beside you for 8 years. Tandy looked at his hat. But he's building something, Walker. He's not just trying to take your land. He's trying to make you look like the wrongdoer before you ever get in front of a judge. Clara said, Who else has he spoken to? Alderman, well, what's left of the Alderman family, young Robert. The Sutter brothers. Pruitt, though, that's no surprise. Tandy paused. He hasn't got to everyone. There are people in this valley who know what Walker is, who he's always been. Would those people say so in front of Judge Crane? Clara asked. Tandy looked at her directly for the first time. Is that what you're asking for? I'm asking whether the people who know the truth about Nathan's water use are willing to say it on the record. Because Harker can put up 2 men with a false story. We can put up the documented evidence, the water use log, the prior appropriation filing, and that's strong. But testimony from neighbors who've worked alongside Nathan for years. She paused. That is the difference between winning cleanly and winning barely. Tandy was quiet for a moment. I'll testify, he said, and I can talk to the Sutter brothers. Thank you, Joe, Nathan said. Tandy stood up and put his hat back on. He looked at Clara. You're the woman they were laughing at in town, he said. It wasn't cruel. It was just a statement. Yes, she said. They're not laughing now, he said. He tipped his hat and went back to his horse. Nathan watched him ride down the road. Then he turned to Clara. You've been building more than a legal case, he said. I've been building what we need, she said simply. He looked at her for a moment. When did you write to Tandy? I didn't. He came on his own. She turned back to the door. People pay attention, Nathan. They've been watching what's happening here. Some of them just needed to know that what they saw was real. She went back inside. He stood on the porch for a moment longer. Then he followed her in. On the 5th day, the letter came from Denver, not from the attorney that one would take longer. This one was from the Territorial Marshal's office, and it was not the brush-off Clara had privately prepared herself for. It was a response from a deputy marshal named Garrett Hale, who had written in a hand that suggested both education and impatience that the diversion of a protected water source in violation of a prior appropriation filing was a matter he would be investigating personally, and that he expected to arrive in Coldwater Creek before the circuit court session. Clara read it twice. Then she handed it to Nathan without comment. He read it, set it down. How did you know to write it the way you did? I used the exact statutory language from the Territorial Water Code. Men like Hale respond to the code, not to complaints. She paused. My father's lawyers taught me that at least. They didn't save his business, Nathan said. Not unkindly. No. But I learned what they did wrong. She picked up the letter. They were reactive. They responded to what the other side did. I've been trying to stay ahead of Harker file before he files document before he acts. Get Hale here before the hearing, so Harker knows there are eyes on him. She looked at the letter. If Harker believes there's a criminal investigation alongside the civil matter, he may pull back. Or he may push harder. Yes, she said. That's also possible. The 5th day was also the day Harlan Briggs came back. Nathan was in the barn when he heard Clara's voice from the yard, not raised, not frightened, but with a particular quality that made him set down the bridle he was working on and walk to the barn door. A man he didn't recognize was standing at the gate. 40-ish soft around the middle, dressed in the kind of traveling clothes that had been expensive once and were now making an effort. Clara was on the porch side of the fence. She hadn't come out to the gate. That gap was intentional. Nathan stood in the barn doorway and watched. Clara. The man's voice had a practiced warmth to it, the kind that came from long use rather than genuine feeling. I know I owe you a great deal of explanation. You don't owe me an explanation, Mr. Briggs. Her voice was completely level. You owe the Bridgeway agency a refund of my placement fee, less whatever they've already returned. You owe the honest accounting of a man who withdrew an agreement without the courtesy of a direct communication. What you do not owe me is whatever this is. A brief pause. What do you want? Briggs shifted his weight. I heard you were in a difficult situation. You felt guilty perhaps. Or you heard I was living on a man's property and thought that information was interesting. Her head tilted slightly. Which one is it, Mr. Briggs? A silence. I made a mistake, Briggs said. Withdrawing the way I did, I should have written directly. Yes, she said. You should have. I'd like to make it right. I'm prepared to offer, Mr. Briggs. Her voice didn't sharpen. It didn't need to. I want you to listen to me carefully because I'm going to say this once. My situation is not difficult. My situation is exactly where I've put it through my own effort on my own terms. I am not available to be made right. I am not a problem you created that you can now solve to ease your conscience. She looked at him steadily. The only thing I want from you is for you to be honest with the next woman whose life you decide to disrupt. Can you do that? Briggs opened his mouth, closed it. He was a man who was accustomed to apologies being received a certain way, and this was not that way. Good, Clara said, though he hadn't answered. Safe travels, Mr. Briggs. She turned and walked back into the house. Briggs stood at the gate for a moment. Then he looked toward the barn, found Nathan in the doorway, and held his gaze for a moment. With an expression, Nathan recognized the look of a man who had just understood in totality what he'd walked away from. Nathan didn't say anything. Briggs left. Nathan went back to the bridle. When he came in for supper that evening, Clara was at the stove, and she had the look she sometimes got back very straight. Movements slightly more deliberate than usual, the way she carried herself when she was using activity to process something she'd rather not sit still with. He let her work for a few minutes. Then he said, You all right? Yes. A pause. I thought I'd feel something different when I saw him. Angrier, maybe. Or relieved. She stirred the pot. I just felt done with it. That's not nothing, he said. Done is good. She looked over her shoulder. I spoke to him like I had something worth protecting. She turned back to the stove. That's new. Nathan put plates on the table. It shouldn't be, he said. She didn't answer, but her shoulders dropped just a fraction from where she'd been holding them. The 7th day brought the thing Nathan had been watching for. He was out at first light checking the creek level. It had held steady since he'd corrected the diversion, but he checked it every morning, the way you watched anything you couldn't afford to lose. He was crouched at the upper channel point when he heard horses below on the road, and he climbed the rise to see 2 riders moving fast past the lower gate toward town. He didn't recognize them. But they were riding Harker's brand of horse, a particular gray that came from Harker's breeding stock, and they were in a hurry. He went back to the house. Clara was making coffee when he pushed in the door. She looked at his face and said, "What?" He told her about the riders. She poured the coffee and handed him a cup and stood at the window. "He's moving something before the hearing," she said. "Men riding fast at dawn means papers or money or witnesses." She turned from the window. "Nathan, we need someone in town today. Someone who can hear what's being said without drawing attention." "Pete Alderman," Nathan said immediately. "He's at the livery. He sees everyone who comes and goes." "Can you trust him? He came 4 miles on horseback to warn me about Harker's men at the creek without anyone asking him to. Yes, I can trust him." Clara nodded. "Go. I'll finish the case summary for Judge Crane. It needs to be ready tonight so we can review it before the morning." He was on Hector and down the road in 10 minutes. Clara sat down at the kitchen table with the papers and worked. She had been working for 2 hours when she heard the second horse on the road. Not Nathan's pace, too slow, too tentative. She went to the window. A woman was at the gate. Ruth Alderman, the one from Vera Pruitt's visiting party, the one with the kinder face and the similar opinions. She was alone without a buggy on a tired-looking sorrel mare, and she had the look of someone who had argued with herself all the way up the mountain and lost. Clara went to the gate. They looked at each other. "Miss Whitmore," Ruth said, "I owe you an apology." Clara waited. "The day you arrived, what we said, what we did, what we didn't do." Ruth twisted the mare's reins in her hands. "I've been thinking about it for weeks and I can't. It wasn't right. You were alone and frightened, and we stood there and—" "I wasn't frightened," Clara said. Then more honestly, "I was frightened. I didn't show it." Ruth's expression shifted. "That made it worse, I think. The way you held yourself. Some of the women thought it was pride. I thought it must have cost a great deal." She met Clara's eyes. "I'm sorry. That's all I came to say." Clara looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "It did cost a great deal." She opened the gate. "Would you like coffee?" Ruth looked surprised. "You're not angry?" Clara considered. "I was. I'm not now. Come in." Ruth tied her horse and came inside and sat at the kitchen table among the papers and the ledgers and the legal documents spread across every surface, and her eyes moved over all of it with an expression that went from surprise to comprehension to something that was almost respect. "You've been doing all this," she said. "We've been doing it," Clara said. "Nathan and I." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Harker's been telling people things. About Walker. About you." "I know. He told Ed Pruitt that Walker's been taking water illegally for years. Ed's been spreading it." Ruth looked at her hands. "I know Ed. He wouldn't spread it if he wasn't sure Harker could make it stick." "He can't," Clara said. "We have documentation going back to 1861. Prior appropriation fully filed." She poured the coffee. "What else has Harker been saying?" Ruth hesitated. "He told Vera that you—" She stopped. Started again. "He said that you came here with nothing, and you've positioned yourself to benefit from Walker's property, and that when the dust settles, you'll—" "Take what I can and leave," Clara finished. Ruth nodded unhappily. Clara set the coffee cups down. She sat across from Ruth and she said carefully, "Mrs. Alderman, I came here with a broken plan and a bag of papers and no money and no certainty. Nathan Walker gave me a roof and didn't ask for anything I wasn't willing to give. What I've done in this house for the last month has been because it was right, because I was able to do it, and because—" She paused. "Because the people who try to take things from good people make me furious. That's not positioning. That's just who I am." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need?" she said finally. Clara blinked. "What?" "For the hearing. What do you need from people in town who know Walker is a decent man and what Harker is trying to do isn't right?" Ruth straightened up in her chair. "Because I'm not the only one who's been thinking. I'm just the only one who rode up here. Yet." Something opened in Clara's chest that she hadn't expected. "Testimony," she said. "Character testimony for Nathan. And anyone who's had dealings with the First Territorial Bank that felt irregular, anything that speaks to a pattern. She pulled out a blank sheet of paper. "Can you write down names?" Ruth picked up the pen. Nathan came back at noon with Pete Alderman's report. Harker's men had spent the morning at the bank. The bank manager had been in for 3 hours with the door closed. 2 legal documents had been dispatched by fast rider to Glenwood Springs direction, unknown. And a man from out of county, well-dressed, carrying a document case, had arrived on the morning stage and gone directly to Harker's hotel room. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. When Nathan finished, she told him about Ruth Alderman. "I was quiet for a moment. Ruth came up here." "She did." Clara looked at the list Ruth had left. "She gave me 11 names, people who will speak for you, and 3 who may have information about the bank's practices." She set the list down. "Harker sent a lawyer to Glenwood Springs this morning, which means he's trying to challenge the prior appropriation filing. He's going to argue the documentation isn't valid or that there's a gap in continuous use." She met Nathan's eyes. "Is there a gap?" "Any year your father might not have used the creek water," Nathan thought. 1876, he said slowly. "Drought year. Father piped in from the North Spring instead. Barely used the creek at all." "Is that in the log?" He pulled the notebook from the satchel. They went through it together, page by page, year by year. 1876 was there. 2 entries. His father, meticulous to the end, had written creek low. Diverted to North Spring. Creek use minimal, sufficient for stock only. Clara exhaled. "He documented the drought year. He documented everything," Nathan said. She looked at the notebook, at his face. "Nathan, your father knew someone might try to take this land someday." He was quiet. "He kept that log like it was armor," she said. "He was protecting you, decades before it mattered." Nathan's hand rested on the notebook cover. He didn't speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was lower than usual. "He used to say, 'Write it down, son. The land doesn't lie, and paper doesn't forget.'" Clara set her hand on top of his on the notebook. Not briefly this time. She left it there. He turned his hand over and held hers. Neither of them said anything. Outside, the wind was coming down off the peaks, the way it did in the late afternoon, dry and warm and full of the smell of pine and high altitude. And the cattle were moving in the north pasture, and the creek was running at its right level, and the whole place had the particular quality of something that had been fought for and was still standing. After a moment she said, "We should finish the summary tonight." "Yes," he said. He didn't let go of her hand yet. She didn't pull it back. When they finally went back to the papers, they worked side by side at the table, instead of across from each other, the way they'd been doing since the beginning. Not because it was necessary. Because it was where they'd ended up naturally, without discussion, the way most true things between them had happened. The morning of the 8th day, they drove into Coldwater Creek before the sun was fully up. Judge Harold Crane arrived on the 9 o'clock stage, which was 20 minutes late. He was a compact man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the efficient manner of someone who had seen every variety of frontier dispute and had opinions about time-wasters. He set up his court in the back room of the Coldwater Creek meeting hall and told both parties they had until 2 o'clock. It was not an informal proceeding. Harker's lawyer, the man from out of county, a Denver attorney named Waverly, was polished and experienced, and came with documents that challenged the Walker water use log on grounds of irregular recording intervals. Clara had anticipated this. She handed Judge Crane the 1876 drought entry and explained in precise and unemotional language that irregular recording intervals were the natural result of irregular water use, and that a man who documented less use in a drought year was demonstrating accuracy, not inconsistency. She then presented the prior appropriation filing, the certified copies, and the dated receipt showing the 1871 bank loan had been paid in full in March of 1873. Waverly objected to the receipt's authenticity. Clara produced the bank's own ledger page, which she had formally requested as part of the document discovery she'd filed with the court, and showed Judge Crane the entry that corresponded to the receipt, which had been partially obscured by a subsequent notation in different ink. The room went very quiet. Judge Crane looked at the ledger page for a long time. He looked at the receipt. He looked at Waverly. "Counselor," he said, "would you like to explain the discrepancy in ink color on this ledger entry?" Waverly said he would need time to investigate. "You've had 8 days," Crane said. He set the documents down. He looked at Clara just once briefly, the look of a man who recognized work when he saw it. Then he looked at Nathan. "Mr. Walker," he said, "how long has your family held this land?" "Since 1859, Nathan said. 24 years. "And you intend to hold it?" "Yes, sir, I do." Crane made a note. He called Joe Tandy. He called 2 of the other witnesses from Ruth's list. He listened to all of them with the same contained attention. He was writing his ruling when Deputy Marshal Garrett Hale walked in the back door of the meeting hall. Hale was not a large man, but he moved like someone who'd learned that authority was mostly about direction. He handed Judge Crane a document without speaking. Crane read it. His expression did not change exactly, but something behind his eyes did. He looked up at Harker, who was seated at the opposite table with Waverly and 2 other men, and the particular careful stillness of someone who has been in powerful rooms his whole life, and was beginning to sense that this one was not going the way he'd arranged. "Mr. Harker," Crane said, "Deputy Marshal Hale has filed a complaint of property interference under Territorial Statute 14 Section 9. The creek diversion on the Walker property documented and witnessed." He set the paper down. "That complaint is separate from this proceeding and will be handled by the Marshal's office. However, it bears on the question of intent before this court." He looked over his glasses. "I find the prior appropriation claim of the Walker North Slope Ranch to be valid and senior to all subsequent claims in this valley. I find the bank's loan call to be unsupported by the documented evidence of payment in full." He closed the folder in front of him. "The Walker Water Rights Stand. The loan call is dismissed. Costs are assessed to the First Territorial Bank." He stood up. The room stayed silent for a moment. Nathan didn't move. Clara sat beside him with her hands folded on the table and her case materials stacked neatly in front of her, and she was very still and very quiet, and her eyes were bright in a way that she was not going to let become anything more demonstrative than that. Not here, not in front of all these people. She felt Nathan's hand find hers under the table. She turned her palm over and held on. Harker stood up on the other side of the room. His face was controlled. He was a man who had lost before and knew how to lose without showing it. He exchanged a word with Waverly, picked up his hat, and walked to the door. At the door he stopped, turned, looked at Nathan across the room. Nathan looked back. Harker looked at Clara. She held his gaze without blinking. He left. The room slowly came back to life around them. People moving, talking in low voices. Joe Tandy crossing the room to shake Nathan's hand, the deputy marshal talking to Judge Crane near the back wall. Ruth Alderman, who had come in quietly halfway through the proceedings and sat in the back row, caught Clara's eye from across the room and gave her a small deliberate nod. Clara nodded back. Nathan said close to her ear, "It's done." "The marshal's investigation isn't done," she said. "And Harker still owns the Morrison land and the Alderman property." "That's not my land," he said. "My land is mine." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." Outside the meeting hall, the town of Coldwater Creek went about its afternoon. Wagons on the main street, people on the wooden sidewalks. The normal business of a place that had no idea mostly what had just been settled in the back room of the meeting hall. Nathan and Clara stood on the steps. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to ask you something." "You asked me something the other night," she said. "At the gate? And then we got interrupted." "I remember," he said. She turned to look at him. He said, "I've been living on that mountain for 10 years, and I told myself the solitude was what I needed. That I'd built something worth building even if I was building it alone." He paused. "I've spent the last month watching you work alongside me, and I don't believe that anymore." She waited. "I'm not asking you to stay out of gratitude," he said. "I'm not asking because you've been useful, though you've been more than useful. I'm asking because—" He stopped, looked at the street, looked back at her. "I don't want to go back to quiet Clara, not the way it was before." Her chest felt full of something that had no convenient exit. "Nathan," she said carefully, "I came out here to marry a stranger based on a piece of paper." "I know. I'm not going to do that again. I'm not asking you to, he said. I'm asking you to, he seemed to search for the word, stay, and see what there is. Between two people who know each other now. Actually know each other. She looked at him for a long moment. At the face she'd learned over a month of close quarters, the patience in it, the precision, the way it changed in small increments when something mattered to him and he was trying not to show it. The way it looked right now. She said, I'd want to be useful for my own reasons, not because I'm a guest. You've never been a guest, he said. You know that. She did know that. And she paused. I'd want to write to my father. He should know where I am and that I'm safe. We can send it with tomorrow's post. And I'd want the room with the lock, she said. For now. It's your room, he said. It always has been. She looked at the street. At the mountains above the town, visible even from here, the high peaks going white at the tops, even in August. She thought about the kitchen table, and the ledger, and the porch, and the chair that had been empty for 10 years, and the cedar chest, and a small brown notebook that had saved everything. She thought about what it meant to build something with someone instead of beside them. All right, she said. He let out a breath. She turned back to him. I need coffee, she said. And I need to eat something that isn't cornbread. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before, not fully, not unguarded. It was a good sound, low and genuine and surprised at itself the way laughter was when it came from somewhere a person had kept locked for a long time. There's a decent place on the north end of the street, he said. She picked up her satchel. Lead the way, Mr. Walker. He settled his hat. Yes, ma'am, Miss Whitmore. They walked down the steps of the meeting hall and into the ordinary, remarkable afternoon, and the town of Coldwater Creek watched them go without quite knowing what it was. Watching that something had shifted cleanly and permanently, and the woman everyone had laughed at, and the man everyone had called too solitary for his own good, were walking side by side in the August heat, like two people who knew exactly where they were going. The letter to Clara's father went out on the Morning Post the day after the hearing. She had written it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. The first version was too careful. The kind of letter a person wrote when they were trying not to alarm someone, full of reassurances that themselves signaled there was something to be reassured about. The second was too sparse. The third one was honest. She told him where she was. She told him what had happened with Briggs and the agency and the storm and Nathan Walker and the month that followed. She told him about Harker and the water rights and the hearing. She told him she was not in danger and was not in want and was not asking for anything except for him to know she was well and meant to stay that way. She did not tell him about Nathan's hand under the table in the meeting hall, or the walk down the steps afterward, or the coffee they'd had on the north end of the main street where they'd sat across from each other for an hour and talked about things that had nothing to do with ledgers or lawyers, about his mother's piano, about the Kentucky she'd never seen, about the first winter she remembered, about his first cattle drive at 16. She didn't tell him because she didn't have words for it yet that she trusted. She sealed the envelope and handed it to Nathan to post and went back to the kitchen table. There was still work to do. The marshal's investigation into the creek diversion was ongoing. Hale had left a written request for Nathan's documentation before he departed Coldwater Creek, and Clara spent the morning organizing copies for him. Everything dated. Everything cross-referenced, nothing left to interpretation. She had learned from watching her father's lawyers that ambiguity was the enemy of a good case. Every document she sent Hale was as unambiguous as she could make it. Nathan came in from the morning work at 9:30 and watched her for a moment from the doorway before she knew he was there. She looked up. How's the herd? Good. Creek's running right. He poured coffee and sat down across from her. You've been up since before 4. I know. Clara. He waited until she looked at him. The case is made. Hale has what he needs. You can stop. I can stop when it's done, she said. Not stubborn, just honest. He looked at her. It's done enough. Harker still owns the Morrison land. He still has connections at the bank. Hale hasn't filed charges yet, and until he does, we live our lives. He leaned forward slightly. You've spent a month building armor. I'm not saying put it down. I'm saying you don't have to wear it at the kitchen table. She looked at him for a moment. At his face, which had the expression she'd learned, meant he was saying the difficult thing carefully, not because he doubted it, but because he respected her enough to say it right. She put down the pen. I don't know how to stop in the middle of something, she said. I know, he said. You'll figure it out. He pushed a plate toward her. Eat first. She ate. It was 3 days after the hearing when Vera Pruitt came to the ranch, not with Ruth or the Hartley woman. Alone. On foot, which meant she'd left her buggy at the bottom of the road and walked up, which Clara understood was its own kind of statement. A person who came on foot to your door was coming seriously. Nathan was in the north pasture. Clara answered the gate. Vera Pruitt was a woman who had spent her life being certain she was right about most things. The certainty was still there, but it was sitting differently on her now, less like armor, more like something she'd picked back up out of habit and was beginning to find heavy. Miss Whitmore, she said. Mrs. Pruitt. Clara opened the gate. Come in. Vera came in. She looked at the garden, the barn, the house. She looked at the things that had been fixed since Clara arrived. The gap under the kitchen door, the broken hinge on the barn gate, the kitchen garden fence that had been sagging on one side and was now straight. She took it in with the eye of a woman who noticed domestic details. You've done a great deal here, she said. We've done a great deal, Clara said. Vera's mouth pressed together briefly. Ed had information from Harker's people, she said. About the water diversion. He believed it was true. I know. He shouldn't have spread it. No, Clara agreed. He shouldn't have. Vera looked at her. You could say I told you so. I could, Clara said. I won't. Another pause. Vera turned her hat in her hands, the same gesture Ruth had made Clara noticed, which meant it was something the women of Coldwater Creek did when they were managing something difficult. There are people in this town, Vera said slowly, who owe you an acknowledgement. What was done when you arrived was what it was, Clara said. I don't need the town to feel bad about it, Mrs. Pruitt. I need the town to behave differently the next time someone comes through who needs a kind word. She looked at the older woman steadily. That's all I need. Vera studied her. You are nothing like what I expected. What did you expect? Someone softer, Vera said. Or harder. Not, she seemed to search for the word, not both at once. Clara almost smiled. My mother used to say the same thing. Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Nathan Walker is a good man. He's always been a good man. I should have said that out loud more often, and I didn't because... She stopped. Because it wasn't interesting, Clara said gently. Good men are less interesting to talk about than troubled ones, until they matter. Vera's chin went up slightly. Yes, she said. I suppose that's it. She left 20 minutes later. She had not apologized in so many words. But she had come up the mountain on foot, and Clara understood that was the apology. She told Nathan when he came in. He was quiet for a moment. Vera came up here herself. Yes. He absorbed that. She's not a bad woman, he said, which was generous and which Clara believed he genuinely meant. She's a woman who does what the room expects, and the room was expecting wrong things. Yes, Clara said. That's very charitable. No, he said. It's accurate. He washed his hands at the basin. She say anything else? She said I was nothing like she expected. He turned from the basin and looked at her with the expression she'd come to understand was his version of amusement. No, he said. I expect you're not. A week after the hearing, Hale sent word from Denver. The letter came in the regular post addressed formally to Nathan Walker, North Slope Ranch, Coldwater Creek, Colorado Territory. Nathan brought it in from the post run and set it on the table in front of Clara without opening it. She looked at him. It's your letter. Open it, he said. She opened it. Hale had filed charges. The creek diversion constituted criminal interference with a protected water source under territorial statute. The bank manager had been placed under investigation for falsification of financial records. The altered ledger entry which Hale's office had examined with a second set of eyes and confirmed was in different ink consistent with a subsequent edition. And Douglas Harker had been formally notified that he was a person of interest in a coordinated land fraud inquiry. Person of interest. Not charged. Not yet, but named. Clara read it twice. Then she set it down. "It's not over," she said. "The investigation takes time. He may not be charged." "I know," Nathan said. "But the bank manager is in real trouble, and Harker knows Hale is watching." She looked up. "That changes the math for him. Continuing to press in this valley with a federal marshal's eye on him is a different risk calculation than he came in with." "You think he'll pull back?" "I think a man like Harker doesn't take risks that aren't worth taking. The water rights are gone. The loan call is dismissed. If he pushes further and Hale is building a fraud case." She paused. "The math doesn't work for him anymore." Nathan looked at the letter. "It's enough," he said. Not as a question. "It's enough," she confirmed. He took the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in the cedar chest with his father's papers. Clara watched him do it and thought that was exactly right, that it belonged there with the other documents that had protected this land layered over generations, like the geology of the mountain itself. That afternoon, something shifted in the ranch. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. But Clara noticed it the way you noticed a fever breaking, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small things that added up to different. Nathan spent an hour with the piano, not playing. He'd been honest about that he couldn't play. But he opened the door to the locked room and went in, and she heard him in there for a while, and when she passed the doorway, she saw him sitting on the bench with his hands resting on the closed lid, not moving, just sitting with it. She didn't stop. She kept walking. That was his private thing, and she respected it. But when he came out, his face looked like a room that had been aired out. She was in the garden when he found her. "I'd like to teach you to ride properly," he said. "You've been riding like someone who expects to fall." She looked up from the bean rows. "I have been expecting to fall." "You haven't fallen yet." "That's because I've been careful." "You can be careful and still ride right," he said. "Come on." She pulled off her garden gloves. He spent 2 hours with her and Hector in the lower field, not hurrying, not critical, just showing and adjusting and explaining with the same direct patience he used for everything. She fell once, not badly, a sideways slip getting down, and he caught her arm and she found her feet and he said, "Good, now you know where you lose your balance." And that was the whole of it. She rode the circuit of the lower field twice on her own at the end of the lesson, and when she came back to where he was standing, he had the expression she'd learned meant he was more pleased than he was going to say directly. "Better," he said. "Don't oversell it," she said. He laughed again. She was collecting those, the unguarded ones, the ones that surprised him. She was keeping track without intending to. On the 12th day after the hearing, the letter came from her father. She knew it immediately when Nathan brought in the post, her father's handwriting on the envelope, the particular slope of it that she'd known since childhood, his name in the upper corner because he believed in putting his name on things he sent. She took it to the porch. She sat in her chair. It was hers now, completely without qualification, and she opened it and read it. Her father wrote the way he talked, which was to say carefully and with effort, every word chosen, because he meant it. He wrote that he was relieved. He wrote that he had worried. He wrote that the man who had given her shelter in a storm and stood beside her through what followed sounded like a man worth knowing. He wrote in the last paragraph in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest. "I'm sorry I couldn't give you a better start, Clara. You deserved one. But it seems like you've built one yourself the way you always did with everything. Your mother would have said the same." She sat with that for a long time. Nathan came out and sat in the other chair. He didn't ask. He let her be. After a while she said, "My father approves." "Of what?" She gestured vaguely at the mountain, the ranch, all of it. "He hasn't met me," Nathan said. "He knows enough." She folded the letter. "He said you sound like a man worth knowing." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "That's a good thing to be." "Yes," she said. "It is." She put the letter in her pocket. She would put it in the cedar chest later, she thought. with the water use log and the prior appropriation filing and the paid receipt and Hale's letter. All the documents that told the story of this place and the people who had fought for it. That evening, Ruth Alderman came up with her youngest son, a boy of about 9, who had the solemn, watchful quality of a child who paid attention to the world. She brought a jar of preserved peaches and a look that said the peaches were not the point. The point turned out to be a question. "Robert's thinking about his cattle next season," Ruth said when they were on the porch with coffee. "He's got 30 head, and he's not sure about the winter feed situation with the Morrison land under new ownership. He doesn't know who to talk to." Nathan said, "Tell him to come up. We'll go over the options." Ruth nodded. She looked at Clara. "There are others who might benefit from—" She stopped, chose her words. "From someone who knows how to look at accounts and ask the right questions." Clara looked at her. "You're asking if I'd be willing to help people in the valley with their books." "I'm asking if you'd consider it." Ruth's voice was careful. "Not charity. People would pay what they could. But there are families here who don't have the education and who've been vulnerable to—" She paused, "to the kind of arrangements Harker was building. And now they know what that looks like, but they don't know how to protect themselves from the next one." Clara looked out of the mountains. She thought about her father's business and the 2 years in lawyers' offices and the vocabulary of men who took things with paper instead of force. She thought about how long it had taken her to learn what she knew and how much it had cost and what it might have meant to have had someone explain it plainly when the danger was still preventable. "Yes," she said. "I'd be willing." Ruth exhaled. "Good," she said. And then more quietly, "Good." The boy ate his peaches and watched Nathan with the focused attention of a child who had found something worth studying. As they were leaving, he tugged on his mother's sleeve and said something in her ear, and Ruth looked faintly embarrassed and said, "He wants to know if Mr. Walker would teach him to rope." Nathan looked at the boy. The boy looked back with enormous gravity. "Next Saturday," Nathan said. 7 o'clock. The boy's face split into a grin that was entirely different from his solemn default expression, and entirely wonderful. Clara watched them go down the road and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness. Exactly happiness was too thin a word for it. It was more like the feeling of a room that had been empty long enough that you'd forgotten rooms were supposed to have people in them, and then someone opened the door, she said, still watching the road. "Ruth just started something." "I know," Nathan said. "People are going to come up here." "I know. Is that all right with you?" He turned to look at her. "It is if it's all right with you." She turned to look at him. That question, if it's all right with you, was not the question of a man asking a guest's permission. It was the question of a man who had already accepted that someone else's preferences had weight in a place that was also theirs. She felt it land. She let it. "Yes," she said. "It's all right with me." It was the last Saturday of August, when everything that had been building between them finally said itself out loud. They had been working the east fence, the one with 43 broken posts that had been the first project of her first full week, and that had taken the better part of the summer to properly finish, because there was always something more urgent. Today, there was nothing more urgent. They worked through the morning, Nathan setting posts, and Clara handing him the wire, and the tool she'd learned the name of 3 weeks in, and now handled automatically. They worked in the comfortable silence that had replaced the careful silence of those first weeks. The comfortable kind was full of small exchanges, a word, a gesture, a look that communicated without requiring translation. She had not known before this that silence could be that full. At noon they sat in the shade of the fence line and ate the lunch she'd packed, and Nathan said out of nothing, "I want to ask you something." "You keep saying that," she said. "I keep getting interrupted." "No interruptions in sight," she said. He turned to look at her directly. She turned to look at him. The August light was high and bright and honest, and it left nowhere to hide, which was, she thought, probably appropriate. "I'd like to marry you," he said. No preamble, no speech, no architecture around the words. Just the words themselves. She held his gaze. "Why?" He didn't look surprised by the question. He'd expected it, she understood. He'd thought about what he'd say. Because I've spent a month watching you work and argue and think and refuse to be diminished by anyone, and I've never once wanted to look away, he said. Because you came here with nothing and made yourself essential to everything, not to impress anyone, but because that's what you do. Because when Harker's lawyer handed you that falsified record, you read it twice and then told a room full of men what was wrong with it without raising your voice. He paused. And because the ranch is better with you in it. Not because of the accounts or the legal work. Because of you. She was quiet. I'm not asking you because it's practical, he said. I'm not asking because you came out here to marry someone and you might as well. I'm asking because I want you to stay, and I want it to be on terms that are real. He looked at her steadily. But I meant what I said before. I'm not asking you to decide out of gratitude or out of having nowhere else to go. If the answer is no, I'll understand it. She looked at the fence post he'd just set solid in the mountain ground. She looked at her hands, which were rougher than they'd been in August, and which she found she didn't mind. She looked at him. I came out here to marry a stranger based on a piece of paper and 2 letters, she said. I don't think that was wrong exactly. I think the specific man was wrong. The instinct wasn't. She paused. I'm not a romantic, Nathan. I know what I am, and I know what you are, and I know what we've built here in 2 months better than I knew Harlan Briggs from 2 years of correspondence. She met his eyes. So yes, I'll marry you. He exhaled. It was not a theatrical moment. There was no speech, no demonstration, nothing that would have looked like much to someone watching from a distance. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had under the table at the hearing, certain and quiet and complete. And she held it the way she had then, and they sat in the August sun on a finished fence line, and let the thing that had been true for weeks finally be said. I'll write to my father, she said after a while. I'd like to write to him too, Nathan said, if that's acceptable. She looked at him. You want to write to my father? He should hear it from me directly, not just about you, about what I'm asking him to trust me with. He held her gaze. A man ought to say those things himself. Something moved through her that she had no defense against. He'll like you, she said. Her voice came out less steady than she'd intended, and she didn't try to correct it. He doesn't like many people, but he'll like you. Because you say what you mean, and you mean what you say, and you don't waste words. She looked at their joined hands. He's always admired that in people, and never quite managed it himself. Nathan looked at the mountains. Soon as we can arrange it. There's no reason to wait. She considered. Ruth Alderman's husband is a justice of the peace. He is, Nathan confirmed. Then next Saturday after the roping lesson, she said. If that works. He turned and looked at her. The expression on his face was the most unguarded she'd ever seen it. Not performance, not careful management. Just the face of a man who had been given something he hadn't let himself want for a long time, and was discovering that the wanting had been there the whole time waiting. Yes, he said. That works. They shook on it. That made her laugh, the laugh that surprised her with its own warmth, and he looked at her, laughing with the expression she was going to spend the rest of her life being glad existed, and then they finished the fence. On a Saturday morning in early September, with the Rockies going from summer green to the first cold edge of autumn gold. Clara Whitmore married Nathan Cole Walker in the front room of his family's ranch with Ruth Alderman and Joe Tandy and Pete Alderman and the boy who had learned to rope standing as witnesses. There was no piano music because Nathan couldn't play. But before the ceremony, he lifted the lid of his mother's piano and ran his hand along the keys once gently, and Clara stood in the doorway of the locked room, her former room, the room that had been her first safe place in a long time. And she understood what he was doing. He was telling his parents. She didn't say anything. She gave him the moment. Justice of the peace. Alderman was a quiet man who had married enough people to know that the vows were not the point, and the people saying them were, and he moved through the ceremony with the right combination of brevity and weight. When Nathan took her hand at the necessary moment, he held it with the same certainty as always. Not performance, not occasion. Just the specific quality of his attention that she had come to understand was the way he treated everything that mattered. She said what she meant. He said what he meant. That was all. Afterward, Ruth had brought cake, real kill cake, not cornbread, and Pete Alderman had brought cider, and Joe Tandy had brought a speech that he abandoned halfway through in favor of simply saying, "Walker, you done right," which Nathan received with the small nod of a man who agreed, but didn't need the ceremony of it. The boy ate 2 pieces of cake and told Clara solemnly that her husband was the best roper he'd ever seen, which was not high praise, given that the boy was 9 and had been roping for 3 weeks, but she received it as intended. By the afternoon, people had drifted home. The ranch was quiet. Nathan and Clara sat on the porch in the long September light, and the mountains were doing the thing they did at this time of year. The slow color change that started at the highest elevations and worked its way down like something being decided gradually. He said, "Your letter to your father." "I'll write it tomorrow," she said. "Tonight, I don't want to write anything." He looked at her. "What do you want?" She thought about that honestly. "To sit here," she said, "and not think about what needs doing next." "That's allowed," he said. She leaned back in her chair. "Is it? I've been forgetting." "I'll remind you," he said. "As often as necessary." She closed her eyes. She thought about a woman standing on a road in a storm, with a battered bag, and no one coming. She thought about what it had cost to stay standing in that moment, and in all the moments after, in the store doorway, in the wagon, coming up the mountain, in the land office, in the meeting hall at the gate, when Harker's lawyer came. She thought about everything it had taken to get here, to this porch, to this chair, to this man sitting beside her, with the long patience of the mountains themselves. She thought about the fact that the plan had been wrong, and everything that came after had been better. She opened her eyes. Beside her, Nathan was watching the mountains with the settled quiet of a man who had spent 12 years building something and had just understood fully and finally that he had not been building it alone. That the whole long arc of it, his father's careful notebook, the water use log, the cedar chest, the locked room, the piano that still held a tune, had been pointing toward this. Toward having someone beside him who could see it for what it was. He said without turning, "My mother would have liked you." Clara felt that all the way through. Why? She asked, the way she asked him most things, because she wanted the real answer, not the comfortable one. Because she was practical, and she was fierce, and she believed that doing a thing right was more important than doing a thing easily. He paused. And because she always said the best people were the ones who showed up to hard things without being asked. Clara looked at him then. He looked back. "I didn't show up," she said. "I got caught in a storm." "You stayed," he said. "That's harder." She held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly. "It is." The mountains held their color. The creek ran at its proper level. The cattle were settled in the north pasture. The cedar chest sat in the front room with all its layered documents, the water use log, and the deed, and the paid receipt, and the prior appropriation filing, and Hale's letter. And from today, the marriage record signed by a justice of the peace in the Coldwater Creek territory. All the papers that said this place is real, and the people who built it are real, and what was built here was worth protecting. Below in the valley, the town of Coldwater Creek was the same town it had always been, full of the same people, doing the same things, mostly decent and mostly afraid, and mostly just trying to hold on to what they had. Some of them had stood in the street and laughed at a woman with a suitcase in a storm. Some of them had ridden 4 miles up a mountain road to offer testimony for a man who'd never asked for anything. Most of them were somewhere in between. That was people. That was the frontier. That was the whole long, complicated truth of it. But on the north slope in the ranch that a Kentucky man had built in 1859, and his son had held for 12 years, and his son's wife had helped save with a water use log and a paid receipt, and the particular fierce precision of a woman who had learned that the law was a tool, and tools were for people willing to use them on that north slope. The evening was quiet, and the porch was full, and nothing had been given that hadn't been earned. And the woman. Everyone had called a mistake, a charity case, a woman who ought to have known better. That woman sat in her chair on her porch on her mountain with her husband beside her, and she looked at the life she had built from a collapsed plan and a stranger's open door, and she knew something that took most people their whole lives to learn. Being left behind is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is the very thing that delivers you through a storm, and up a mountain road, and into the life that was always meant to be yours, the one that couldn't have been given to you, that you could only have built yourself with your own hands and your own will, and the one person who saw you clearly from the first moment and chose you anyway. Not out of pity, not out of circumstance, out of recognition. That is what lasts. That is what no one can take with a legal notice, or a falsified ledger, or a carriage full of arrogance, rolling up a mountain road uninvited. That is the thing Harker never understood, and never would, that some things don't have a price because they were never built to be sold. They were built to be kept. And on the north slope of the Colorado Rockies, in the last light of a September afternoon, Clara and Nathan Walker kept what they had built together without apology.